Got no mark from somewhere.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar, which is all about avoiding failure in IT transformation projects. So we will begin in a couple of moments. We're just going to give it a few more seconds for people to join, and then once we think we've got a critical mass of everyone that's due to attend, we'll start with some introductions and we'll get straight into the webinar. Okay, I think we've got everybody present now. So once again, thank you for joining this morning's webinar. It's all about IT transformation and how to avoid those project failures that we've all experienced from time to time in the past. To get things started, I'm going to do some brief introductions of today's panel, and then we'll get straight into some questions and hopefully some really useful examples of the types of projects we've all worked on over the years. So without further ado, to my left is Rob Douglas. Rob has worked in the utility sector across Europe in a sales executive and account executive senior roles across many of the leading system integrators that you'll all be familiar with. So he's sold a lot of and managed commercially a lot of IT transformation projects. To balance that experience, we've got another Rob Berry, and he has procured and contract managed many different IT transformation projects. So he'll be able to talk about the buy side experience and the lessons learned, and Rob will bring the sell side. And then myself, I'm Warren Kazera. I'm an executive director at Barker's, and if you hadn't guessed already, at Barker's, we help companies buy a lot of complex IT transformation projects, and critically, we like to think we help them avoid many a failure along the way. So without further ado, and I'll start with you, Mr. Berry, could you please just help us understand from the many procurement projects you've done over the years, just share some of your thoughts on the typical challenges of those IT transformation projects?
Yeah, thanks, Warren. So I think probably the first thing about this is that companies are not going out every day and doing this. IT transformation projects tend to come along every so often. And therefore, companies are not necessarily used to spending time and knowing exactly what they need to do during those projects or programs. And what tends to happen is they underestimate just how complex they actually are and how difficult they are. Quite often you see companies who that they'll have had a demonstration of some shiny new technology solution, and they'll look at that and they'll go, brilliant, that's exactly what I want. When can I have that? And of course, actually, it's far more complicated than that. You've got to look at how do we integrate that into our existing technology estate? How do we look at our business processes? What change is required around that? And there's this whole heap of complexity and unknown that a lot of organisations wander into without realising what they're actually doing. And I think for me, that's the role where we as technology procurement experts can have a massive influence, because actually we do this quite regularly. We understand some of the challenges that we'll face time and time again, and therefore we can help guide the business and sponsors through that process and help them to be successful.
Brilliant. Thank you, Rob. And Rob Douglas, from the sell side, does any of that resonate with you? And just share some of your initial thoughts on the typical challenges organisations face when buying these large, complex programs.
Yeah. So Rob just articulated all of it really, just the way he opened that up. So all those issues need to be addressed, but the big one for me is leadership in terms of the visibility of someone who is going to sponsor and commit to delivering at a very senior level to deliver the project successfully, to time, to budget. But that person needs to be around to to help answer a lot of those questions. I mean, these are complex. These are very, very complex programs. There's a lot of unknowns. I mean, the procurement people and the supplier side try and work all that out before you start. There's always going to be challenges along the way. So the leadership piece is absolutely key in terms of quick decision making, or authority to make changes and all those sorts of things. If you've got the right leadership, the right commitment from the leadership, the right visibility and sponsorship, then you're just going to be able to address those issues far quicker and achieve the success that you want.
Brilliant, thank you, Rob. So the criticality of having the experience of doing these things before, and then also on the client side, the importance of strong, clear leadership and have real clarity on what the project's there to achieve. Yeah. Let's get into some real examples, because I think that will help bring things to life. And if I come back to yourself, Rob, could you share a couple of examples of projects that you've been involved in and how you were able to overcome the challenges that those projects presented?
No, so I think the first one that we'd probably talk about was I worked for a large global pharmaceutical company, and we were implementing a new source to pay platform, which was Ariba. As a company, we didn't have a huge experience of implementing that type of technology. It was something that hadn't been done for over 10 years in that organisation. And therefore, it was quite a challenging project in terms of what we needed to do as a procurement organisation and team, and as well as what we needed to do from a technology standpoint. So the way we actually approached that from a procurement standpoint is, whilst we were looking to identify an appropriate implementation partner for Ariba, we did a market scan. We looked at the players in the market, and we identified, in addition to some of the big tier one organisations, the big consultancies, we also identified some boutique players within that market who were real specialists in implementing Ariba. And what we actually decided to do is, whilst we decided we didn't want to take them forward as an implementation partner, we approached them and asked whether they would be interested in being a client-side advisor to us. So what we did in essence was we brought real capability and knowledge and put it on our team to help us to manage the implementation partners, to make sure we were doing the right prerequisites at the outset of the project, and to make sure that we had a really comprehensive understanding of what might go wrong during the project. Now, actually, a few months into that project, it did become quite difficult, and the tier one consulting partner we were working with actually hadn't stood up as capable a team as we would have liked, and we were seeing some real challenges. And what we were able to do was we were able to leverage that boutique organisation to bring resources in and effectively help us to keep that programme on track. So that's a way of recognising that potentially you don't have all of the capability you would like. So actually bring some of that in and get it to work for you, in addition to having an implementation partner. And the other bit that it gave us is it gave us the agility and ability to quickly flip to a different delivery model, which meant we avoided costly delays, meant we kept on track and actually kept the programme broadly in line with the original timescales and business case.
That's a great example, Rob. Thank you for sharing. And I think it brings to life, it's the old adage, don't put all your eggs in one basket. I know it's very simple to say, but actually when you fully commit to a large global system integrator that's delivered a fantastic presentation. And I remember many years ago, I was the procurement aspect of a presentation at National Highways, not at National Highways, rather, at National Grid. I won't mention the system integrator, but we delivered an amazing presentation, and I sat there in awe listening to the delivery lead. And I said to them, and I'll call him John. I said, John, that was amazing. I'm really looking forward to working with you. And he looked at me and said, what do you mean? I said, I'm working over there. He said, I'm not going to be working on this project. And I'd assumed he was going to be the delivery lead, but no, actually he wasn't. The team that would have delivered that is not always the team you think it's going to be. And also, organizations do sometimes struggle to bring all the necessary experience to bear on a project. So having the intelligence and the experience on your side of a client-side advisor, if you can double whammy that with the ability to then bring some of their resources to complement. So rather than blame the primary lead and everyone falling out, sometimes actually taking a more mature approach, being able to blend resources from different parties can help keep a project on track. So brilliant example. And I think you've got another really good example. So we'll go straight to that as well.
Yeah, no, that's good. So the second one was a project that we undertook quite a few years back now, where we were replacing a legacy GIS system for a utility company. This and we replaced it with what was the leading edge technology, and is still the leading edge technology in that space today. From a procurement standpoint, it brought many challenges with it, but actually the reason why we reference this as a really great project is because we got involved from a procurement standpoint right at the outset of the process, and we managed it all the way through the life cycle to delivery and go live. And I think that being involved from a procurement and commercial management perspective was invaluable to the business and the customer, or the ultimate customer. What we did at the outset, and I talk about this because it's probably really important, is because we were involved, we talked to the suppliers really early into the process, the implementation partners who were going to work with us, who we were running a procurement exercise for. And we actually got their inputs and insights, and they highlighted what were going to be the key challenges. And actually, some of the key challenges we'd not considered as being major challenges. So actually, the thing they brought to the fore was actually data migration was going to be a huge challenge on this project, because we're taking something that's over 20 years old. The business are using this, and it's effectively critical to people's lives, because if they dig a hole in the wrong place, they might go through a gas main or an electricity cable. So that, we're mapping critical assets on this platform. It's really, really critical to the business. But from that procurement process, we got involved and we engaged with the market right from the off. We engaged with the business, and that helped us to really shape what we went to market for and asked for. And then, as I say, once we'd awarded that contract, we then managed that contract and worked closely with the supplier throughout. And it was difficult at times, because we're replacing something that's over 20 years old and doesn't look any different to what the business were using. It was light years in terms of business change, but we worked really closely with them, and we were able to mitigate lots of challenges and proactively work with the suppliers and the business to overcome the challenges we face. So that's another really sort of great example of get involved early and stay involved right throughout the process, because there's value that can be added right throughout that from a commercial standpoint.
Yeah, and it was a very successful project, as I recall. And Rob, you were also involved in this very successful project, a rare thing. It's probably why it was so many years ago. Perhaps could you share from your sell side sales executive experience, can you bring to life your recollections of that project and why it was so successful from the system integrator perspective?
Yeah, I think the first thing to say is it was successful because we still speak to each other. Remain friends beyond that point, haven't we?
Yeah.
So so I'll answer this in two respects. One is quite like you said at the start, over 25 years experience of working with customers on these sorts of transformation programs over the years. So there's two sides to this. One is a personal point of view. So one is these procurement processes tend to take an awful long time. And everyone understands the reasons why, in terms of the customer needs to understand what it's trying to do, how it's going to fund it, how it gets its approvals in place, how it identifies all the risks, and how it manages all those things, how it wants to go to the market. But sometimes the customer will try and almost become the expert themselves. Now, we all get it. I've been on the supplier side, and it's often a frustration. But generally, those things just slow everything down, and it creates challenges in the supplier organizations in terms of, because they want to manage resources, they got pipelines to manage and all this sort of stuff. So that's the sales sort of side. But on the other side, when you actually work through all those things, you understand that procurement actually sets the tone of the engagement. It's really, really, really key. So if you're setting the tone of the relation of the engagement in terms of how you want to do things, if you want to use advisors, all this stuff needs to be on the table as part of the procurement process. If the supplier sees that, they can ask questions why, and they get the answers they need to keep their own organization on board with what needs to happen, the length of time it's going to take, the importance of it all, and all this sort of good stuff. So my view would be now is based the experience that you have is shortlist as quickly as you possibly can. Work out quickly who you think you can work with, and then move on from that point. Because if you can do those things quickly, I think the benefits and the success is far greater.
Yeah, holding a large group of suppliers,
absolutely,
when they know only one or two are going to be the successful parties, it becomes difficult for the supply organisation to keep justifying the level of intense effort and investment in that, unless as a minimum you're narrowing the field so they know they've got a higher probability.
I suppose even more so now with digital, because the pace of change with digital is really, really quick. So, sorry, Rob, but the older ways of buying things needs to change so it adds flexibility and speed of decision making, all this sort of stuff.
There's a lot more specialist providers in the market that are augmenting or complementing existing legacy solutions, and there's a lot more specialist delivery partners as well that will understand those technologies and how to leverage them. But I think one of the key things I've picked up from what you've said, from what you've both said there, is that the procurement organisation really needs to have bought similar things before, and just a generic process won't necessarily get you to the right outcome. So to mitigate the risks and the pitfalls, you need to understand how to buy projects like this, and that only comes with experience. But in that context, Rob, could you just perhaps expand upon the role you feel procurement plays in bringing that experience and mitigating those pitfalls?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I think that there's probably a number of different facets to that sort of procurement role. And the first one is to sort of be that strategic business partner to your sort of key stakeholders. So lots of IT transformation projects run into problems because, for want of a better phrase, sort of key stakeholders within the project lack that sort of level of education or understanding.
Sure.
So, there's a business sponsor who's seen some shiny new piece of technology and says, right, I want that on everybody's desk, but for the first week of January. And realistically, that's already flawed because the timeframes that are available just don't exist. So I think there's a role particularly for procurement to help to educate people, to reference back to their experiences, to be able to credibly sort of articulate, if you do this, this will happen because I've seen it all of these times before. And I think ultimately that experience and that ability to be able to sort of walk somebody very sensibly and logically through, here's all the things that will go wrong if you carry on this path, is incredibly valuable and helpful. And that doesn't need to come from a I know better than you perspective, but it can be, you know, very much, listen, have you thought about this? Because I did this at this organisation and this is what the outcome was and it wasn't great. You might want to try and consider this. And very often your stakeholders quickly sort of realise the value that you're bringing from a procurement standpoint. I think, you know, clearly using that experience to build in enough time is absolutely critical. I think the other thing that really good procurement and particularly technology procurement experts can bring is that ability to engage early and effectively analyze the market and understand what it is that they're buying. So you sort of made a comment before, Warren, which is, you know, you need to have done this before. And actually, that's not always possible in IT in particular, because new technology is coming along. What you have to be able to do is to be able to leverage your knowledge about how do I go and find out the right information? Who do I go and talk to? You know, very often I would pick the phone up and I'd phone someone like this man and I'd go, have you done this before? You know, or do you know anyone who's done this? Because ultimately, there's things that you are doing which actually are very new to you and your organisation, but being able to understand that, talk to the right suppliers in the market, that's absolutely critical to sort of understanding the challenges ahead. And I think that's what we as procurement can bring, that early engagement, that business partnering, and ultimately that, you know, that sort of real professional diligence around how it is you buy technology.
That experience of having done something before. So let's take this webinar, for example. We don't do them very often, and we're very free to admit that. It's a learning experience for us. And one thing I forgot to do at the beginning, so I'm going to hold my hand up here. Anyone that has questions, please put them into the chat throughout the discussion, and then we will get to some of those questions at the end. And if we can't answer your question, we'll respond to it after the webinar, and we'll also share a recording of the webinar for people that have been present as well.
Could I just add one thing, so Rob? So just what's resonated is, I said just before, you know, try and shortlist early. Yeah. So when you're having those engagements with the senior stakeholders, is bring that wider team into the engagement with you. So it's not just you're not just a single person telling this person, oh, this is what's going to happen, this is how we're going to manage the risks. As a senior stakeholder, I say, well, okay, I believe you, yeah, but I'm not sure. So if you've got the wider team in front of you, even at an early stage in procurement, you know, suppliers will engage. Yeah. If there's senior stakeholders around the table, it gives them visibility. They can actually, you know, see the whites of people's eyes. And they feel a lot more comfortable with what they're trying to do, and they will commit an awful lot more to those engagements.
Yeah, it's a good point, Rob. I was going to ask you a supplementary question, actually. Do you think it's important that the buying organisation understands how the different suppliers might view them? So, you know, in sort of procurement parlance, they might see some suppliers might view that customer as a cash cow or as a nuisance customer, or they might see them as a really strategic acquisition that needs investment in. So that the supply side view of the potential customer, how important is that in these large complex projects?
It's absolutely essential. Absolutely essential. So if you think about it, you know, the suppliers themselves have to go to their organisation and ask for resources and time, and it all costs money, and they're busy organizations, they have multiple customers, but you know, that's what they want to be. They want to be the best in their marketplace, they want to grow. But the more you can create the relationship between the supplier organization and the buying organization and the wider customer organization, absolutely essential. If you don't do it, then the challenges will definitely come, and getting around those challenges is really, really difficult. I've been on both sides of those conversations. Things that work really well, you still have challenges, but you can resolve them, as we did. Things that don't happen so well, yeah, there's a few scars on my back in terms of having those conversations with customers.
So I think it would be remiss of us not to share an example of when projects don't always go so well, and where we might also have been personally involved, because we're not going to sit here today and say that we're perfect procurement, commercial, or sales or account executive professionals. So I'll give one example. Perhaps we can then discuss that. So just briefly, been set the challenge to create a new customer billing solution. It was a strategic project for the client, and it was somewhere that I worked at the time, so I wasn't a consultant. I was there as an employee, and we had a new senior executive that had come in to lead this project, and they set a very aggressive timescale and a very aggressive budget. And we had a brand new entrant into the market in terms of the system integrator and technology provider. They saw the account as strategic. So you're like, right, we've got a lot of leverage here. We can move at pace. We've got their attention. But the project timescales were so aggressive and the budget was so aggressive. In hindsight, we were always going to create a challenging project scenario. So because of the leverage we had and the strategic intent from the supplier to acquire us as a customer, we were able to negotiate what seemed on paper a fantastically great value for money license agreement and system integration contract on the side of that, and everyone signed up to the timescales. So, you know, what happens next? Do we have a super quick, super cost-effective, brand new billing system? No. What unraveled was a bit of a nightmare. It took a lot longer than planned. It cost far more than was in this original agreement, and far closer to the amount we thought might be the case. And it created a huge amount of political pressure and personal pressure on everybody involved in the project. So we got there in the end. I wouldn't have described it as a successful project just because it was very painful for everybody involved, and we set the wrong expectations at the beginning. And I think we were naive in creating this environment that was always going to create these stresses. So I know, Rob, I'd sort of invite you to comment on that and any sort of lessons learned from that experience.
Yeah, I mean, it was quite a difficult one, as you say, with quite a challenging sort of sponsor. But I think probably one of the things that we should have done at the outset was really spent some time understanding what the supply capability was. So one of the real challenges was the amount of professional services people with the skill set and the knowledge of this technology in the market was very, very sort of low on the ground, and it made it incredibly difficult for the organisation in question to be able to scale to the size that it needed to for the implementation programme. So one of the challenges was simply that we just couldn't get the right people available to us. And I think we probably didn't spend enough time understanding that and highlighting that risk up front and what that meant to the programme. So I think that would probably be, you know, one of those key lessons learned. And it's something now that for any IT transformation project that I undertake where we're buying services, I will always ask the suppliers to tell me what skill sets they've got, where are they located, so that we can understand, you know, actually, can they do this? Can they do what they're saying they're going to do? You know, do they have a plan that they're actually going to leverage the contract market to be able to fulfill our requirement, and then what's the lead time associated with that. So really trying to get a much better understanding of how they're going to deliver it, rather than agreeing a contract with them that potentially they can't actually meet.
Yeah, exactly. So
I had a couple of points there. So your example of your experience on that project, that's just a,
don't blame it all on me, Rob.
it's fairly typical of the industry that I've served for, say, 20 odd years, is all those challenges at a very sort of massive scale, you know, where the market's liberalized and they privatize, and everyone was rushing and trying to get things done. Politicians were getting involved, organizations were doing things. There was a huge amount of pressure. And what was delivered is, I'm speaking amongst friends here, is a marketplace that's overly complex now. It costs too much money and all these sorts of things. Now, I suppose the point I want to make here is bring those lessons learned to the table. There's the markets I serve. They work in procurement investment cycles. They're all talking about, you know, net zero and all this sort of stuff. They want to use they have to use technology to deliver all those benefits, but they really need to think about, what did we do last time and the time before that? We can't do the same thing again, and that involves procurement, right? Procurement cannot lead those initiatives into the marketplace the same way they used to, because if they do, they'll just end up with the same results. So organizations like yours, maybe people with my sort of experience, you've got to stand up and say, just take 5 minutes here. What are you trying to do, and why are you trying to do it? No, we're not going to do it that way again. We need to do it a different way. So you really have to use your experience.
Definitely. And we talked a lot about getting the upfront strategy, market engagement, client leadership, getting all the ingredients for success in the pot. So now we've made the recipe. It should taste great. It should look great. But you've got to move on to the next phase. Once we've procured it, we've got a project stood up, we need to do the contract management. And contract management is post-award is absolutely key to continuing to mitigate the risks, to continuing to stay on track with the scope and the business outcomes that we all set out to invest in and achieve. So I think, come back to you, Rob, in terms of the adherence to the compliance of the contract, the importance of that, can you just bring that to life in terms of your experience?
Yeah, sure. So I think, you know, certainly in the dim and distant past, I think there was a tendency for procurement to focus on buying things, getting a really great deal on the table, and then walking on to the next project. And, you know, as we've gone through sort of embedding category management within organizations, there's been a recognition that actually that contract management phase is really critical to mitigating contract leakage and delivering the benefits that have been negotiated as part of the contract. I think even to this day, organizations, big organizations, don't give it the investment and the focus that they should, and I think it's still a neglected element of category management today. But for me, it's absolutely sort of critical on these IT transformation projects to ensure that actually you've got somebody who is making sure that they understand the contract, that their buying organisation is meeting its obligations, because that's a critical element to success. Is you will have a number of prerequisites that, you know, are ultimately sat with the buying organisation that they have to meet as part of their commitment within the contract. You know, you making sure that actually the supplier's meeting its obligations, and you're meeting regularly with the supplier to understand if there's any challenges within that. And I think by proactively managing that dialogue and that conversation, you can achieve a number of benefits. So there's a benefit that actually you don't lose the value you originally negotiated. But we've already talked about the fact that there's so many unknowns and so many big challenges within these sorts of IT transformation projects that if you're only ever reacting to when things go wrong, ultimately the cost is going to increase and spiral quite rapidly. If you can proactively manage things in advance with the supplier, that can have a real positive benefit for both sides, because actually the supplier is able to be more agile. They're able to manage their resources more effectively and mitigate costs to you as the client. So I think, it's not unreasonable to say actually the cost of change, particularly on big, complex, nasty programs like S4 HANA transformation programs, that the cost of change can be as much as 50% of the original deal value. It can quickly spiral that sort of change from what was originally envisaged, and certainly from a time perspective, these things can run on for years longer than what was originally planned.
So that's a big difference, 50%. Rob, can you give us perhaps an example of where you've experienced that or tried to mitigate some of those cost creeps and scope creeps?
No, absolutely. So at Barker's at the moment, we're working on a large S4 transformation program for an FMCG client, where they're rolling out S4 HANA across the globe, and we as a team have been working as part of their commercial team managing the delivery of that with a number of suppliers, and that's often something that's underestimated at the outset. Is actually, we'll get one company and then they'll do it all for us, and very quickly you realize actually you're integrating into multiple technologies and you've got multiple suppliers that you're now having to manage. So having that person in there, they're able to mitigate and change notes, make sure that actually what's within the contract is being adhered to, making sure that the suppliers are providing the resources they said they were doing and they're meeting their obligations. And I think being able to manage that in a proactive way, as we've talked about, that has a huge impact, and we've seen real benefits for the client there, on an enduring basis, where actually they've probably thought at the outset, well, we'll get somebody on board and get the groundwork done, and then we will be in a position to sort of self-manage, when actually they've gone, we need to retain this resource for the duration of the program because it's added so much value beyond the sort of having them in.
No, absolutely. And Rob, from your perspective, you've won a brilliant, prestigious new project. The deal commercials look great. Another one. So post award, how important is it to stay on track commercially, both for the supply side and for the buy side? What's that your experience of a good relationship in that context?
So again, I use the word essential again. And like I said before, the procurement set the tone of the engagement. Really, that's what it's all about. Set the tone of how they want the relationship to work. And it takes time. It takes lots of conversations, some good conversations, sometimes difficult conversations. But if all that stuff is out on the table early on, then you've got, it sets the tone. But it's contract management is obviously essential throughout the acquisition phase. So we're all agreeing what we're going to do, when we're going to do it, but also into delivery as well. And one of the things there is continuity. And it's the continuity of people. So I often had difficult conversations with the organizations that I work with to say, I'm staying on this. Once we've acquired this contract, I'm staying with this contract because I'm part of the continuity. The pre-sales team are part of the continuity. The customer organizations always want the best SMEs, the subject matter experts, to deliver their contract. So it's all about that transition from selling through to delivery is absolutely key. And it's not weeks, it's months, and sometimes 12 months to actually bed things down. We did it, didn't we? Yeah, so I stuck around, sometimes welcome, sometimes not welcome, obviously looking for other opportunities at the same time. But that continuity for me is absolutely key.
Definitely. So I think I'll share another example. We've found ourselves as a business, Barker's, providing both the procurement and then the post-award commercial assurance of complex transformation programs. That at times you've got many a difficult conversation with the sell-side system integrators or technology providers, but actually at the end of the program, having driven a commercially focused, fair approach, they then see the real value in having an over-investment versus traditional approaches in that post-award level of focus and resource, because the governance works well, they get decisions done faster. They might not always be decisions that they would have preferred, but they're fair, and they're fact-based. You can sometimes help take the emotion out of some, angry or disappointed stakeholders that feel let down, and you can bring the balance to say, well, actually, there's some obligations here that we as a buying organization have not met, as well as your concerns about the delivery organization's capability. So bringing that balance and objectivity, making things logical and fact-based, it can make the whole process a lot more manageable. And I think ultimately that does come with the bold statement that if you invest in the post-award resources to commercially assure a program, you will save time, you'll drive better scope and outcomes, and you'll manage risks, and you'll save a lot of money. And it's not about negotiating, the life out of a system integrator to make sure they only get the minimum amount of extra, because there's going to be extra on any program. But actually just making sure that at the end of that, you've understood what more you were buying for what scope and what outcomes and why we needed to make that change. But actually the main cost on any program is normally the run rate of the internal or the project team.
Absolutely.
So bringing decisions to a head, getting to agreement can have huge cost savings as well, cost mitigation, let's call it cost mitigation, to give it its correct title, on these large complex programs. So not to be underestimated.
One of the earlier questions you asked about the supplier organization understanding the buying organization. So all the points you just said there are precisely that's where it all sits. It all sits at that point. If you get it right at the start, there's always challenges, but if you get those things right at the start, it just makes things a lot smoother in the longer run.
So I think at this point, I might say thank you guys for a lively discussion on a complicated topic. We've talked about the importance of internal leadership, about realistic expectations, about procurement setting the tone and the pace of these events, about over-investment post-award in contract management, lots and lots of topics for lessons learned and what could be for endless further debate. But our time is short, and I'd like to leave enough time at the end for a Q&A session. So as we invited halfway through our discussion, I'll put my hand up for that. If there are any questions, we'll now scramble around on the PC and find those and see if we can highlight some of those. But again, if there are not too many questions, then we will send a summary out afterwards to everybody and we'll close the activity. So it's on with the readers and out with the mouse. See if we can find some of the questions on here. That's just someone's raised their hand, but we have asked that if people could put their questions into the chat, and then
any Q&A. It doesn't look like there's any Q&A.
Let's have a look. There's nothing in. Oh, I've got one question here. How can I ensure continuity of program sponsorship and leadership throughout what looks like a lengthy and complex process? Tough question, Rob. Do you want to pick up on that one first?
Yeah, I mean, look, actually, continuity of program sponsorship is often a real sort of challenge, and as is continuity of resources through some of these programs. Some of these programs can run for 3 or 4 years from sort of the start, and clearly within organisations, quite often people do move on. I think probably where we've been really successful in that, and maybe I'll come back to the example we talked about for the GIS platform with Rob, was we had a sponsor at the outset who was sort of really engaged, and he happened to be a Geordie, which I think was why Rob took such a shine to it. But ultimately, I think that individual got really engaged with the program, was talking to the suppliers, really wanted to understand what it was about, and then actually they then moved. I think they left the company actually at that point. But what they did do was they found the right sponsor to take the program on, and then actually they provided that handover and that continuity and that knowledge, and we, from a procurement standpoint, and actually Rob and the supplier team, they provided a lot of support to that new sponsor coming in. And that new sponsor was somebody who didn't have any experience of IT transformation programs and probably was like a rabbit in the headlights in, the first couple of weeks. But because we recognised the importance of that role, we were able to really support them. And I think that's how you probably need to go about it.
Yeah, it's part of getting to know your customer. As part of the sales process. Who's sponsoring, why are they sponsoring, do they know what they're sponsoring? They obviously know how much money they're going to spend and how visible it is, and don't forget there's internal politics in organizations, there's culture, there's all sorts of stuff goes on. But I always come back to the relationship. If you create an effective relationship with as part of the sales process, then it helps everyone stay bought in. Yes, as Rob just said, people move on, but you need to do the correct handover. You need that continuity to stay with the program, all those sorts of good things. And this is just experience, right? There's nothing clever about this stuff. It's just experience. We've done it time and time again, and we just know it works.
Yeah. Great stuff, guys. We've got one more question in the chat. I'm going to ask Rob, can you read it from where you are?
I'll have a go.
In terms of experience, it's behind the camera for me.
So what would your advice be to tackling a procurement system project which must happen by next year due to systems going out of support? I've addressed the urgency with the end client, right? Really, really good question, and probably something that comes up all of the time. So there's a couple of things. I think you actually have to be really careful about setting artificial deadlines around replacing technology. If that technology is actually going to be turned off and it won't be available by that point, then that is a really hard deadline and you're going to have to do something about it.
Sure.
If it's actually just end of support, then probably my advice would be go and explore what options are available, because actually, being quite blunt, most of these legacy systems, they're running on bulletproof kit, they're well established and well embedded, and they're well known, and actually very little goes wrong with them. And I think go away and probably have a look at how many tickets get raised a year for actual incidents, and you'll probably find that you'll get a handful of P3 or P4 tickets raised a year because it's in the right shape. The challenge then come around, actually, you don't want to be held to ransom by potentially the software provider who's providing you that system. That's a consideration. But also, you've got to think about how do we transition in the right timescale. And the reason I say you might not want to get off it next year is because there'll be a whole heap of prerequisites, and what you don't want to do is rush to jump onto a new system and actually miss out all of the critical steps.
Yeah.
So actually, you've got an opportunity when you're implementing a new system to refresh your processes, to cleanse your data, and actually improve your data. If it's a procurement system, you can look at your taxonomy. So actually, I've had rubbish spend data for the last 10 years because my taxonomy is not set up correctly. How can I actually get my taxonomy set up correctly so that I can then get meaningful data and information out? So it's like it's a balancing act, and you're probably going to find you are going to have to land somewhere in the middle of it and compromise.
I think when it's particularly when it's a procurement system, it's quite easy to look at just either the P2P process or requisition to OK to pay, or you might just be on source to contract. And if you've got that procurement focus, then those workflows can be the most important to you and your user community. But actually, in terms of the credibility of the procurement organization with the end users across the entire estate, they're probably plugging away in SAP or Oracle, and what I might say is a large enterprise scale solution that's not as user friendly as some commercially available products. If you think about the end user experience, that's their everyday experience of procurement, a difficult to use system where I can't find my contracts, or I can't work with the suppliers I want to work with as easily as I might like. So reducing the friction in that end user experience, making approvals faster and easier, getting the taxonomy right so you can find things, speeding all of that up, and that ease of access will help you as a procurement function, not only to raise your reputation because the end user's got a much better experience of accessing the contracts you put in place, but also it will then make your jobs easier because you've got a better understanding of usage across the business that's being brought to you rather than being dragged out of a forensic analysis of poor data, which we've all experienced over 10, 20, 30 years of being in the procurement industry.
Can I add to that from a supplier point of view?
Please do, Rob, please do.
Which is unusual. So I've come across this so many times at fairly large scale levels as well. So the cost of actually switching one supplier out and bringing another one is often one of the areas where people do not really understand the cost of change. Yes, you need a new system and you might want new technology or whatever the driver is for the change. You really need to understand the cost of change. And I hate to say it, but on the supplier side, there are organizations out there who play on that, and they play on that massively. So this is where your senior sponsorship or your senior leadership should get involved. Promote the conversation up to someone who has authority within your organization, and go and talk to these suppliers and say, "We understand where you're at. We understand what you're trying to do, but we're in a difficult situation here. Right? If you want to, I've always sold so I can go and sell again to the same person. That's the way. Maybe it's old school. That's what I've always done. So if you want to, you need to raise the game and have another commercial conversation where the incumbent can see. They can see at a very senior level what you're doing. It's like Mr. Trump over in the States. He likes to negotiate. He likes
dangerous topic.
He likes to do a deal. So go and do a deal, but take someone with authority to make that happen.
Maybe just one more point I'll add on this, which I think is important, and sort of you sort of alluded to it, Warren. You're not wanting to replace systems every couple of years. We tend to replace systems and then keep them for quite a long time. So it's really, really important you do it properly, because if you don't, you then pay for it for the next 10 to 15 years. And probably the biggest killer actually of all IT transformation projects, it is user adoption. It's actually, we bought it and here were all the benefits that our users were going to get. And then actually we land something that's, far inferior to what we actually said we were going to deliver. And users just don't adopt it, and they find workarounds, or they carry on working as they used to.
It's a really good point you make, because not the topic for today, but in the Barker's digital team that implements procurement technology, the methodologies we've created are far more about business change than they are about the technical aspects of the product, because those configuration skills, those integration skills aren't the bit you want to engage the business in. It's the usage and the value they get from it. So we spend a lot of time focused on that. Couple more points and then we're going to wrap up. So we've got a question here from Richard. His first point is not a question, it's just an endorsement of the point we made about procurement setting the tone at the outset. And as a delivery person, it's so hard to then change the approach to what is needed once the project has commenced. So getting it right at the outset is fundamental. So I think we'd all wholeheartedly agree with that. And then on the back of that, we've got a question. We've got about 3 minutes to answer it, guys. What level of involvement would you expect procurement to have in the generation or assurance of the business case? And he's asking here because often it's the business case that unlocks additional funding throughout a major project, and it's a business case in this person's view that should be the anchor point for these decisions, which I would immediately say is a great point, and we would agree with. But do you want to pick up on the business case, Rob? Because I know you've a funding committee where you've reviewed that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, look, I've worked in organisations where, to Warren's point, procurement were a key element of sort of funding approval and funding committees, and I think procurement have to play a key role in helping to generate the business case, helping to assure it. Ultimately, if there's a significant amount of third-party costs going into that business case, then actually getting procurement's eyes on it, getting to think about what's realistic, what are the likely risks, what are the potential size of those likely risks, so we can help to quantify that business case. But I think as well, like if I go back to what I said at the very start, we've got lots of experience of doing this multiple times before. So actually, we can probably call out, here's some of the pitfalls on your side for the internal cost resource. Mm-hmm. And for me, it being able to say, well, actually, we did this before and we massively underestimated the amount of work we would have to do data cleansing. So actually put some money aside because you're going to have to cleanse your data. You take an S4 transformation, moving onto S4, mm-hmm. and that's a completely different rewrite. It's completely different data sets. That's a huge cost. Having somebody from a procurement perspective being able to give some insight and input to that, I think that's critical. Yeah. So I'd always look to try and be involved.
Definitely. I think on that, the business case aspect, the final point I add there is that you'll have a project sponsor and a project director, but with that business case, they need to make sure that all of the senior stakeholders around the business might be in different operating units, that they've agreed to it, because often the benefits that are underpinning the business case, not just the need to change, but the benefit of change, that will be upon different business units, different operating areas or regions actually making the change and supporting it and getting on board with it. So you want a whites of the eyes meeting with all the key influencers on the project, not just those that are core to it and have agreed to carry the torch for the organization. So getting everybody on board and reminding them of their obligations is another important part of that. And we're on that tone, on that note, we would like to say, I will say thank you very much to Rob Berry and Rob Douglas for your insights today. It's been a pleasure to host the discussion. Thank you very much to everybody that has listened in and attended, and for the excellent questions. Keep them coming. We will answer them offline as well, and we look forward to doing more sessions like this and sharing knowledge and experience. So thanks again. Please give us your feedback, and we look forward to the next time. Bye for now.